business with the dishes.
Okay, go ahead.
I've been talking about how I got a job teaching expository writing in the College of Arts and Sciences as a teaching fellow at Harvard after having come back to Cambridge with a master's degree from the University of Connecticut. I went into the expository writing building, which is across from the Harvard Faculty Club, on Prescott Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I met an old friend of mine who I'd known when I was, well, maybe during my undergraduate days. You know, whether, I don't know what year I was in when I knew Don Bacon. He, very nice Harvard student. I don't know what class he was in ultimately, but he was writing his dissertation on Tennessee Williams plays, and he was very happy to see me. We hadn't seen each other for about 8 or 10 years. I'd been married and divorced or separated from my wife, mother of my son David, for some time. And he hired me to teach summer school. And later, teaching expository writing. Later, Roger Rosenblatt rehired me in that job. And I kept that job from 1972 through the 70s to 1976, when I went to Milton Academy for 1 year, teaching 10th grade English and senior English and American literature. I also had a course of 8th grade girls at Milton Academy, because Milton had been at one time a boys' school and also secondarily a girls' school. I was in the girls' school. Now, interesting thing about Milton was that in the girls' school, everybody got into Radcliffe from Milton who applied if they had just moderately good grades. The boys' school is a different matter. It's maybe harder to get into from the boys' school. Now, about this time, I'm talking about 1968 when I went back there. One of my good friends and my history teacher, David Wicks, whose brother also was my teacher of philosophy at the Lawrenceville School, had gone to become headmaster of Milton Academy. Now, 1968 was a very political year with a lot of rebellions on campuses, and there was a sort of difficult year at Milton Academy, and it made it very, very difficult for David Wicks. His father had been the chaplain at Lawrenceville School and was a great preacher. David Wicks, as headmaster of Milton Academy, was not liked, and because apparently there was, because of the student unrest, nobody felt that he handled that very well as headmaster of Milton Academy. So he went back and retired, and his wife, Valerie, had Alzheimer's. The last time I talked to him, he said after 10 years, she finally recognized who he was. It was very sad. And he died about 2 years later after I talked. I had a long talk with him on the phone. He was down on Cape Cod, place. And then
Westport.
They had a property in Westport, family property, near Rhode Island, Westport, Massachusetts. The year I taught first at Milton Academy, I took over from Paul Monette, who was taking a year off, like a sabbatical, and he taught there for about 7 years. He was a Yale graduate, later became quite well known, writing gay novels for Avon, original pocketback book novels, quality paperback novels, and later he went with his lover, Roger Horowitz, who actually helped us incorporate our company, publishing company, vactor and Goodhart, to Los Angeles, where he wrote screenplays for about $150,000 a piece, and continued to publish his gay novels with Avon, and I think he also did the screenplay of that awful book, forget the name. So it doesn't matter. It's no great importance. Paul went on to get a National Book Award for his book about his education at Andover and then at Yale. Sort of his midlife, half a life, I think he called it half a life or something like that. And it was a terrific book. He's a wonderful person, very, very energetic and handsome, and terrifically well educated at Andover, and had a great career at Yale too, before he came to teach at Milton Academy. And he was very interested in me when I went out for an interview, when I found out that he was considering leaving Milton to take a year off. We read all of the Canto issues, very, very admiring of what we had accomplished with the Canto Review of the Arts. And he had a book accepted by of his poems by Little Brown, and also a novel, which I don't know if we ever completed, but he did complete his book about his education at Andover.
You completed the novel.
I don't even know. Are you sure?
Yes.
I had no idea about that. At any rate.
The Avon books came later. The first novel was published with Little Brown. But it was when
what it was about.
When he came down with AIDS, and which he contracted from his partner.
But that's not what the novel was about.
No, but then he started.
Well, he had this whole series of books about his love of Roger Horowitz, and having been unfaithful to Roger, he actually passed on AIDS to Roger and killed
It was
Roger.
Roger who passed it on to him.
No, it was not.
No?
You're absolutely wrong.
Oh, well, I'm glad to know. Anyhow, they were
And then
great
he wrote a
friends.
beautiful elegy called Elegy to Raj, a very, very experimental and very interesting poem, which I have a copy of here someplace, in Saint-Michel de Livet, Normandy. I was able to take my son Davy with me to Milton, and although I was only receiving $10,000 a year teaching there, his tuition was paid for by my teaching there. So that was a very big thing in our lives, in Davy's life and in mine, to make sure that he was getting a really good first-class education at Milton Academy. It was a very successful year. His first year, he studied math with a man named Vanderlog, and he had been a little bit uncertain about his math up to that point, but that was a terrific year. And he also had another man teaching at math named Aravides, who was from Greek origins, and a very, very inspiring teacher who taught really in the old tradition of the great Greek teachers like Aristotle and Plato, with a lot of imagination. So Davy was really lucked out in that way. And he had pretty good sciences there too, though. I think he has maybe ideas about how the sciences might be better taught, since he's now become a well-known scientist, biologist himself, full professor of cell biology and neuroscience at Harvard Medical School. The Milton year was a hard year. I'd had such an easy time teaching expository and creative writing at Harvard, with classes twice a week, and I was teaching 26 hours a week at Milton. It was really real work. Lots of papers to grade, lots of comments to write. Every month, about 25 paragraphs on the students' progress for their parents who were paying for their education. And these were mostly quite well-to-do, successful corporate people at a time when business was beginning to sort of take off in Boston again. And a lot of new startup companies were getting off the ground.
When was this? What was the approximate date?
This was 1975, 76. And I think David graduated in 1982 from Milton with a cum laude, and went on to Johns Hopkins. He didn't even apply to Harvard, although his mother and I had gone there. But he, of course, it ended up becoming a full professor there later, after being a postdoc at Berkeley and having gone to undergraduate, doing his undergraduate years at Johns Hopkins, and then getting his PhD at UCLA and his postdoctorate at Berkeley.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Sit here.
Vodka and orange juice. Too strong?
Wonderful.
Need ice?
No, I think it's fine.
Maybe I put 2 ice trays in. I think working for me, ice would be better.
The vodka's really nice because you can taste the fruit.
Yeah, I guess. Quite ready, but
Can I continue talking?
Please.
I said something about my grandfather, John Presley Landreth. He was a very handsome brunette, very dark black hair. And when he was sometimes out in Oklahoma, I remember that there was one picture he had sitting next to some Cherokee Indians who had gotten out there on the Trail of Tears. And of course they found out oil. A lot of them discovered oil. And it was a big joke was that with their oil holdings, they would buy Cadillacs. And when they'd run out of gas, they'd just go and buy a new car. If they were out of gas. One time he was sitting with a couple of them and turned to one of them and he said, "Do I look like a Cherokee Indian?" He said, "Oh yes, you're Cherokee, just like us." He had very striking, handsome features and wonderful photographs of him with a kind of like a Borsalino hat, which I gave to my Uncle Jack, which I hope his son JT has. But he had a great life in Chicago after he pulled himself out of a big loss during the crash, 1929 crash. He was able to buy up stocks at $3 and $4.
This is after losing how much money?
$1.5 million.
And the bank gave him a good loan?
$450,000. This is a Great Northern Bank. The loan officer later said he could have probably been fired for that because there's no collateral. It's just he knew that my grandfather his word was good and that there would never be any problem. I mean, and that's not the way loans were granted in the old days. They were usually done with collateral, or the due diligence would show how much the person applying for the loan was making in whatever job they had, what kind of annual expenses they had for mortgage payments, insurance, all the utilities on their house, children's education, etc., etc., etc. But this man with a Great Northern Trust probably simply asked my grandfather how much he made with his Spring Packing Corporation, which made a product, a very extremely simple product. He brought a patent on from a man who invented it. It's simply a clump of cotton waste threads, little, maybe an eighth of an inch to a quarter of an inch long, into which were tumbled these tiny copper springs. which gave the clump of cotton waste resiliency. They were put in what is called the journal box of a boxcar. And the journal box encloses the spinning end of the wheel, which is called a journal, and this rides on what is called a bearing, which is hot polished steel, and the whole weight of a boxcar rides on that bearing. So the problem is lubrication. How do you keep friction from building up the heat to the extent that sometimes the journal would become cherry red and just break off, and you get a train wreck. That's called a hot box. The spring packing made him about $35,000 a year. I'm sure that a loan officer knew that. And it's too much. I can't eat that much. It's stuffing too much money. You know how I am. I have very limited capacity, and I really don't like to eat when I'm drinking. Thank you for offering. So my grandfather had a very comfortable existence for the years before he died in 1935 of a coronary thrombosis on his way with my grandmother for their winter vacation in Phoenix, Arizona.
If he couldn't have died in 35, you wouldn't have known him.
What?
He couldn't have died in 35.
I didn't say 30.
That's what I heard.
He died in 1945.
Okay, that makes sense.
A person who died in 35 is David Ellsworth and vactor, my other grandfather, paternal grandfather.
Whom you never knew.
That's right. Only knew about 2 stories about him. I call my maternal grandfather Da, and my grandmother Teddy. Her name was Mabel Virginia Redmond Landreth. My full name was John Presley Landreth, Landreth. His office was at 333 South Michigan Avenue, right across from Grant Park and the Art Institute. About 500 yards down from Orchestra Hall, the top of which was the eating club. My father had lunch with people like Frank Lloyd Wright every day with his rehearsals, called the Cliff Dwellers. And over here in France, they would call it the Troglodyte Club. I could walk down there. I had the privilege of eating lunch there myself, and I had my office for a while. And the office my grandfather had done his business in, and with his secretary. And across the street, not across Michigan Avenue, but the next street over, which I forget, I don't know which street it was, maybe Wabash, was the Chicago Club, where he ate his lunches with his friends and often played bridge afterwards. So he had a very nice life. You could call on major railroads just by walking up Michigan Avenue north. And in some of the high-rise buildings were the purchasing agents of all the major corporations in the world, some of whom had their home offices in Chicago. Some just maybe their purchasing agents in one of the high-rise with skyscrapers. And I was able to enjoy that proximity, go up and call on purchasing agents also. And I never ate at the Chicago Club. I ate at my father's club, the Cliff Dwellers. Sometimes I ate at the Union Club. There was also, I think, a university club that people ate at. And some fancier clubs like the Tavern Club, which, I mean, my uncle belonged to all those clubs. He belonged to the Racket Club, the Tavern Club, the Chicago Club.
How was it you decided to go to New Brunswick instead of staying in Chicago? Why could not Anita have gotten a doctorate at University of Chicago?
Why don't you ask her that?
But I mean, did you not suggest it to her? You were so beautifully connected in that city to have a great life.
I know, I should have tried to get a job at General American Car Company. I had plenty of experience in the railway business at that point. And then I would never have had to worry about retirement and be in the situation that we're in right now.
For sure.
Although we had some good friends in Chicago, like Gerald Hine and
Honey, don't touch with
John
your fingers,
Dean.
please.
What? Don't touch what?
Just continue with the video. It has obviously nothing to do with you. Just fixing the fire. Just talk into the thing. Don't expect us to be silent just because you're talking. Go ahead.
Well, I can't answer that question.
She wasn't asking you a question.
She did ask
She
me.
said, "What are you doing with your fingers?" to me. I was fixing the fire. Dave, just continue with your video. She wasn't talking to you.
She did talk.
No,
to me.
she talked to me.
No,
I did.
Yes, she did.
I did ask
Come
him
on,
a question.
get things straight.
I did ask him a question
All right.
because he was saying so many wonderful things about his life in Chicago and his grandfather's life and all that came in his way because of his family's connection.
Well, I have a good story to tell about Doc, whose life I imagined was a great pleasure. And because my father and mother always talked about it as a kind of ideal existence for a businessman, to have a wonderful club across the street, which also had a driver and a limousine. And every time we came to Chicago to the airport before O'Hare was built, we'd be picked up by the driver in a limousine.
How incredible.
It was called, what was that airport, other airport?
O'Hare.
No, not before O'Hare.
I wasn't there before O'Hare.
All right. We come up from Knoxville on the plane, and the driver would be there. You know, there'd be wonderful, thick sort of blankets to pull over our knees in the freezing weather. We'd be picked up at the airport by one of the Chicago Club drivers and taken out to my grandmother's house, Teddy's house, and my grandparents' house on Sheridan Road in Evanston. Or if we were staying at my uncle's, at one of his magnificent houses, he had a house, really a French chateau brought over piece by piece from France when he was living with Val, the first part of their marriage, before they were divorced and separated. And then, so, this story, I know my grandfather had some philanthropic interests, one of which was the Lake Bluff Orphanage. But one of his friends that he ate lunch with at the Chicago Club was the chairman of the board of Sears Roebuck. Now he'd asked this man for a donation to Oak Bluffs Orphanage, which was up quite near Lake Forest, where my uncle later lived on Green Bay Road, in a huge house, where I spent some of when I worked for him at Spring Packing when he was running it, before I took it over. Well, when his friend who was running Sears Roebuck turned him down, he obviously got another idea. He had bought this absolutely magnificent estate west of Chicago, in the woods. It was, I remember walking the paths. I mean, it was the most extraordinary piece of land, a huge house. So, what he did was, he took his friend, a Sears Roebuck friend out there, and showed him this place. This place, the guy was so jealous of it, he tried to buy it from Da. And Da said he wouldn't sell it to him unless he gave so much money to Lake Bluff Orphanage. And so the guy did it. You know, he got something like $50,000 out of him because he sold him at this place that this guy envied. And I think it's just a great story. You know, and it's like the stories he told about his uncle, his brother Ed once had some friends who were climbing up in the society in Fort Worth after making millions of the oil business. And they'd be asked to go on a symphony board. You know, they'd be raising money for the hospitals. I mean, and once I asked one of my cousins for money for one of my business projects. He said we only give money in Texas. Well, that was typical. And so this one person had given, who was president of a symphony board, had given, or he found one of the donors to the symphony had given something like $10,000. He called him up. He said, I see you gave $10,000 to the symphony last year.
I thought it was 4 million or 2 million.
No.
And then he said if you double it to
Just
4
a minute,
million.
no.
I remember this.
I remember it too.
It wasn't that much. It was like, I see you gave 10,000 last year to the symphony. He said if you give 20, you don't have to go to the concert. He got it.
That's a funny story.
And I have in my piece, Concert Night, a character who's at this, after the concert dinner at our house that is catered by Edgar and Susie, this very handsome couple. His name is Owen Bowden. He's introduced to Bill Moore, and Owen talks about having taken the job of being president of the Knoxville Symphony Board. He said, I thought it was a defunct organization, which when I accepted their request to have me take over as president of the Symphony Board. but I see that it's growing pretty well. And Bill Moore said, well, Dave tried to get me to help out, and but I said it's not easy to get anybody in Knoxville to give any money. And fortunately, there are a few good old friends like Edith Lutz, who gives as much as she can. For which all of us are grateful.
Why don't we just switch to wide instead of unload?
So my father managed and conducted a symphony orchestra that had very, very little financial backing, and only since his retirement from both the university job, School of Fine Arts that he had created himself, did finally some of the corporations in Knoxville, Tennessee, start giving money to the symphony. Before, you couldn't get a penny out of it. I mean, even though he had a lot of good friends, having been made Man of the Year 3 years in a row for the Rotary Club and the Kiwanis Club. But none of these people, even though they had businesses, ever gave, had their companies give to the symphony. And I guess they thought that the arts and business didn't go together. Maybe they don't.
They thought it was enough just to go to symphony without doing more than that. As we experienced.
People in East Tennessee were very tight. A hard place to raise money. Almost as bad as Boston. I mean, when I got $1,200 from my friend's mother, she yelled at him, "I'll never give another cent to Canto Review of the Arts." Her name is Geraldine Nelson. She had plenty of money to give. She became a very good friend. And I was actually, her friendship was more valuable than anything she might have given.
Well, that is for sure.
What was your best and what was your favorite experience raising money?
Well, one time I got money from a man named Landon Clay, who had found emeralds in Brazil and gold. And I think he recently offered $1 million for the solution of a math problem. But he gave something like $2,000. He invited me to lunch at a club in Boston called the City Club. And you were not allowed to pass papers over the table. You did not go there and try to raise money over lunch. But what he did throughout the lunch was to go through an issue of our literary magazine and say, "You changed person in the second paragraph on page 212," and stuff like that.
Well, it was had a pretty sharp eye.
He's from Georgia. I think he still lives with his mother. But he was quite an elegant fellow, and you forget the company he worked for. It was a very snazzy investment company. Vance. Anyways, Da had grown up in Joplin, Missouri, been sent to military school, and the only child sent among all the brothers, and there were like 10 of them, 10 brothers. Ernest, Will, Ed, Charlie, who committed suicide. My grandpa was the only one of all these brothers who was sent away to school. And there was something called the Miami Military Academy. And it's in Miami, Missouri. I mean, it's something I've never heard of, had never heard of before or since. But apparently he and his friends were doing pranks and set off a giant firecracker in a tin can, and probably it made a big sound, and he got kicked out. So it was a huge failure because the family really didn't have a lot of money. His father's name was George Washington Landreth. Which is sort of amusing because also one of my father's uncles was Abraham Lincoln, then back there. To use the names of presidents as middle names. Interesting. So it was a horrible failure that he felt great shame about. He always felt tremendous amount of shame about being a bedwetter. And the week before he died, going to Phoenix, Arizona with my grandmother, he got me up every night to take me down to the toilet and help me relieve myself, hoping maybe he could help me through this problem that he felt tremendous shame about. They call him, his brothers call him Johnny P-Tail. So he wanted to spare me from that shame. And it was a big problem, and it took me a long time to get over it. But I did get over it. I was able to go to camp, and then away to Lawrenceville School. And never wet my bed at Lawrenceville. Didn't wet my bed at camp. My cot at camp one time because it was a hot August night. We'd had a lot of watermelon, and that's what I wasn't supposed to do. Be very careful about to not drink anything before I went to sleep. Any water or anything. So Doc got me up, 4 or 5 times in the night and helped me down the hall to the toilet. Stood there while I relieved myself. Helped me get back into bed and back to sleep. Very sweet man. He was an extremely sweet man. But one day, it was right before lunch. I went on a little walkabout, walked out of the house on Sheridan Road, up the street, and up the hill where the Baja Temple was. Now this was the temple of there was a writer who wrote a whole book about the Baja religion. I forget his name, but the favorite of my parents, and I had that book in the house. It was one of the only sort of Eastern religions like Hinduism or Buddhism that was in our house. It was called The Prophet. I forget the writer's name. But the Baja Temple was a very, very gorgeous building with a dome and some windows, not stained glass windows, but a dome that had some interruptions in the structure to let in light. It's at the top on Ridge Avenue, the top of the hill. I didn't go over, didn't cross Ridge Avenue to cross over. I was very careful about crossing the street. And I just went up there and was looking around, and some kids came along, and they wondered where I lived, and I told them. And So I just spent time talking, and I think maybe the girl said, why don't you come over to our house? And I may have gone over and spent some time at these nice kids' houses. And then I came back home, and my grandfather was furious at me because they'd been very alarmed that they couldn't find me. They called, no answer. They didn't know where I was. And there were accidents. That's how children got killed. And they'd lost their beautiful daughter, who would have been my Aunt Anne. She's blonde and absolutely beautiful. I have she was Aunt Nancy. I have pictures of her still. And a painting of her. Beautiful painting.
In our house.
It was a memorial painting. In their house on Amory Street in Cambridge. Really good painting of a child. And it was a great tragedy in my grandparents' life. She had an infection of the forget the name of the bone. It's behind the ear. And my mother had a cold or something. She was made to feel that she had passed along the infection to her sister. And made to feel guilty about it. It was a huge tragedy in my grandmother's life. Neither of my grandparents ever got over the loss of Nancy.
Parents did.
She was 9 years old.
Parents did.
A beautiful, beautiful
I
child.
think she was younger than 9.
No, she wasn't.
She died at 7 or 6 or very young.
I have a picture of her riding on my grandfather's back with her brother and her sister on another part of his back as if he were a donkey or something. And very hard for my Uncle Jack to lose his sister. And very, very hard for my mother. I don't think my mother ever got over it. Her mother never did. It was very hard for my poor grandfather. And so that when I came back to the house, I had to go out into the back, and he took out his penknife, and he took a little branch from a thorn bush, and with his penknife he just cut it off, and he switched my shins with that. And since it was a thorn bush, it hurt like hell. And I never forgave him for that. I think that's really why I got rheumatic fever, because when he died, I laughed. I was still angry at him. And I loved him intensely. He would let me climb all over him and mess up his hair, his black hair, which he always had beautifully combed, and run my hands through his hair. And he always loved to smoke cigars. He had a thermidor in the hall, had always the best Cuban cigars available. And he would, when he'd smoke a cigar, there was a glowing coal from the ash, he'd say, open your hands, and I would open my right hand and make a sort of cup, and he'd drop the coal into it. So that took some kind of trust that he knew what he was doing and it wasn't going to burn me. I mean, when I picked up that burning, glowing like an ember piece of wood, when my father and I were harvesting some of the vegetables in our vegetable garden on the farm near Marshall during the Second World War, my father let me pick up this burning piece of wood, and I don't think I ever trusted him again. And he said, oh, don't worry, it will be all right. He went up and got some burn jelly and and it plastered it all over, and it healed up, you know. It wasn't a horrible injury. And then he went out and took a turnip from the ground, covered with mud, took out his, what he always called it his farmer's friend. It was a knife that had all sorts of different kinds of blades, some with screwdrivers on them, and can openers and all sorts of things. And he took this knife, which he called his farmer's friend, and it was sort of like a Swiss Army knife, that handy. And he just took a big peel off of it. The mud fell away, and then there was a knife, which he wiped on his blue jeans, the mud off of. He cut off a piece of this bright, glistening white meat of a turnip. He said, "Here, taste this." He said, "It's delicious. It's not hot." It wasn't like a white radish. It was. I never liked turnips. I think I didn't like turnips because he liked turnips so much.
I'm so sorry, but dinner's ready now.
I'm just about finished. So I was glad to eat this piece of turnip, and it was good. He was right. It was good. It was clean. There was no mud on it, and so that's a happy memory. And unfortunately, talking about my grandfather makes me rather sad. Because I was so angry at him for punishing me, for walking off without telling him where I was going. But, right after he died, I got was diagnosed with rheumatic fever, which was a long, long process to heal it from. And I got very ill, so that I was actually, my immune system was totally shut down. And I mean, I got infections in my little finger, and I had other infections that were dangerous. My really health was at risk, extreme risk. But I pulled out of it, still kicking against the pricks, as St. Paul would say, in Normandy. Raring to go every morning with some new ideas. Keep myself from dying of boredom.